May 1921, Oklahoma. A woman named Molly Burkhart woke up before sunrise, like she always did, and wrapped an Indian blanket around her shoulders, like her father had taught her. She was Osage, and in 1921, being Osage meant something extraordinary. It meant you were, per capita, the wealthiest people on the face of the earth. Oil had been discovered beneath their reservation, and the money was almost impossible to wrap your head around. In 1923 alone, the tribe took in more than $30 million. Today, that's roughly $400 million. Let that number breathe for a second. These were people who had been pushed off their land again and again across generations of broken promises and deliberate cruelty. The U.S. government had marched them into the rocky hills of northeastern Oklahoma, land nobody else wanted, land they called worthless. Worthless, until somebody looked underground. So Molly had servants and cars and a beautiful wooden house. She had a white husband named Ernest who had learned to speak Osage just to talk to her. She had children and a mother and sisters. She had everything. And then, one by one, it started disappearing. Her sister Anna vanished on a warm May evening. 3 days passed. Then 3 more. Then a boy was squirrel hunting near a creek, and he chased after his shot, and he stumbled down into a ravine, and he found something in the mud. A body. Bloated. Decomposing. Shot, execution style, in the back of the head. It was Anna. Now, here's what I need you to understand about this moment, because this isn't just a murder mystery. This is something far darker, far more calculated. The question isn't who killed Anna Brown. The real question is, how does an entire community become a killing field and nobody notices? How does evil hide itself inside a smile, inside a handshake, inside the word friend? That's what this book is really about. David Grann's Killers of the Flower Moon isn't just history. It's a forensic examination of human greed at its most sophisticated. It's the story of how wealth attracts predators, how power corrupts institutions, and how the people we trust the most are sometimes the ones sharpening the knife behind our backs. Let's talk about William Hale, because to understand this story, you have to understand William Hale. He called himself the King of the Osage Hills, and the nickname wasn't ironic. He wore a bow tie and round-rimmed glasses. He donated to hospitals and churches. Politicians needed his blessing to win elections. He signed his letters Reverend W.K. Hale. He was, by every visible measure, the most upstanding man in Osage County. He was also, allegedly, an architect of mass murder. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Osage Nation had been through something that would break most people. Think about it. In the 17th century, they controlled a territory stretching from Missouri to the Rockies. Then came the treaties. Then came the broken promises. Then came the forced migrations. By the time Molly's parents were young, the tribe had been relocated to what most whites considered a rock pile in northeastern Oklahoma. And then, underneath that rock pile, they found one of the largest oil deposits in American history. Within years, they were millionaires. The press called them Red Millionaires and plutocratic Osages. Reporters marveled at Osage women wearing French clothing in remote reservation towns. There were brick mansions, diamond rings, chauffeurs, private planes. But here's the thing William Zinsser would tell you to pay attention to. When money arrives suddenly, in a world that wasn't built for you to have it, the predators follow, the U.S. Government, in what they called an act of protection, assigned white guardians to many Osage members, people they deemed incompetent to handle their own money. Full-blooded Osage, by default, were classified as incapable of managing their own finances. A man who had fought in World War I, who had risked his life for this country, couldn't sign his own checks. That system of guardianship, supposedly designed to protect the Osage, became the machinery of their destruction. Guardians controlled spending, guardians controlled estates, and when an Osage died, the guardian often positioned himself to inherit. So follow the logic. follow the money. If you are connected to enough Osage people, and if those people start dying and their wealth flows through you, you become very, very rich. This is the architecture of evil that Grann spent years excavating. It's not the raging violence of a monster. It's patient. It's institutional. It wears a Sunday suit and carries a Bible. Molly's mother died 2 months after Anna. Then her sister Rita's house was blown into a million jagged pieces by a bomb placed directly beneath her bedroom window. 3 people died that night, including Rita and her husband. The explosion was so massive, it shattered glass in neighboring towns, sending a shockwave through the dark prairie. It wasn't just a murder anymore. It was a declaration of war. Think about the psychological toll of that. You are Molly Burkhart. You have watched your sister get shot, your mother waste away from a mysterious illness, and now another sister has been blown out of her bed. You have millions of dollars in the bank, but you cannot buy the one thing every human being needs to function: safety. The Osage began stringing lights around their houses, turning night into day. They stopped going out after dark. They locked their heavy wooden doors, loaded their rifles, and waited in the center of their living rooms. But how do you fight an enemy you can't see? How do you shoot a ghost? Because the real monster wasn't hiding in the shadows of the prairie. The real monster was having coffee at the local diner. He was shaking hands at the bank. He was, in many cases, sitting right across the dinner table. This is what Robert McKee means when he talks about the ultimate conflict. The conflict here wasn't just man versus man. It was man versus an entire corrupted system. Let's look at the local law enforcement. When an Osage person was found dead, the local coroner would usually rule it a suicide or alcohol poisoning. A man could be thrown off a moving train and the official report would say he just slipped. Why? Was everyone in Osage County a psychopath? No, but they were compromised. You see, when the river of money is that deep and that fast, it carves through morality like water through soft rock. The sheriff, the judge, the private investigators, the doctors, they were all on William Hale's payroll. Or, if they weren't on his payroll, they owed him a favor. Or, they owed the bank a favor, and Hale controlled the bank. It was a brilliant, invisible web. And Molly was the fly. But Molly did something that takes a kind of courage most of us will never possess. She fought back. She hired private detectives. She offered a massive reward for information about her family's killers. She went to the local priests. She went to the lawyers. And for her trouble, she got a target painted directly on her back. Molly started getting sick. It started as a subtle weakness, a slow, terrifying draining of energy. Her doctors, the exact same doctors who were supposed to be healing her, diagnosed her with diabetes. They told her she needed a revolutionary new treatment. So, her husband Ernest, the man who had learned her native language, the father of her beautiful children, began giving her these injections. And Molly only got worse. Let's pause the narrative here and dive into the psychology of Ernest Burkhart. We want monsters to look like monsters. We want them to have fangs and yellow eyes. But evil is rarely that cinematic. Evil is usually just a weak man who wants to fit in. Ernest was a pawn, a willing pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. His uncle, William Hale, told him what to do, and Ernest simply did it. Hale convinced him that the Osage wealth was destined to end up in white hands anyway. Why shouldn't it be their hands? It is terrifying to realize how easily a human being can compartmentalize murder. Ernest could play with his children in the front yard, kiss his wife on the forehead, and then go meet with the men who had just put a bullet in his sister-in-law's head. He didn't see a contradiction. He saw it as securing his family's future. But the bodies were piling up too high. The local corruption was too obvious. The reign of terror was no longer a local secret. It was making national headlines. And in Washington, D.C., a young, obsessively ambitious man saw those headlines. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover had just taken over a disorganized, corrupt little agency called the Bureau of Investigation. It was a complete joke. His agents had no power, no prestige, and very little funding. Hoover wanted to build an empire. He wanted to create the modern FBI. But to do that, he needed a win. He needed a high-profile case to prove that his vision of scientific, federal law enforcement was the future of America. He looked at the Osage murders, and he didn't see a human tragedy. He saw a stepping stone. Hoover's initial attempts to solve the case were a total disaster. His agents went in loud, arrogant, and completely ignorant of the local culture. They were easily manipulated by Hale and his cronies. Hale even used the federal agents to frame innocent people, just to show how untouchable he really was. Hoover was embarrassed. And Edgar Hoover did not handle embarrassment well. He realized he couldn't send a bureaucrat to catch a wolf. He needed a hound. So he called a man named Tom White. Tom White was absolutely everything Hoover wasn't. Hoover was a man of files, index cards, and pristine tailored suits. He never went into the field. Tom White was a former Texas Ranger. He stood 6'4", wore a Stetson, and had spent his entire life chasing outlaws across the unforgiving scrub brush. He had seen men die. He had killed men. White represented the old frontier justice. Hoover represented the new, sterile, filing cabinet justice. It was a massive clash of eras. When White took over the Osage case, he knew the rules of the game had to radically change. He couldn't just interview people. He couldn't trust the local badges. He had to go completely underground. White assembled a team of deep undercover operatives. This wasn't something the Bureau did back then. It was completely unorthodox. He found an agent who could effortlessly pass as a corrupt insurance salesman. He found another who looked exactly like a roughneck cattle buyer. He even recruited a Native American agent, which was unheard of at the time. He sent them into Osage County with one strict directive: don't act like lawmen. Act like the kind of men who would sell their own mothers for a tiny piece of the Osage oil money. They drifted into the dusty towns, they sat in the dark saloons, they played poker, they listened. And slowly, very slowly, they started to pull at the loose threads of William Hale's massive criminal empire. The undercover agents discovered the hidden network of hitmen. They found out about Al Spencer, a notorious outlaw who had been hired by Hale. They learned the exact going rate for a murder in Osage County. Sometimes it was $1,000. Sometimes it was just a used car. Human life had been brutally reduced to a simple accounting error. But the most dangerous part of Tom White's investigation wasn't finding the killers. It was keeping his witnesses alive long enough to actually testify in a courtroom, because William Hale wasn't just sitting back. He knew the federal agents were circling. And Hale's response to pressure was always exactly the same: more blood. A man named Smith, who knew too much about the bombing of Rita's house, was suddenly found dead. A lawyer who was preparing to blow the whistle was violently thrown off a moving, speeding train in the dead of night. White realized they were rapidly running out of time. Molly was slipping away, her frail body ravaged by the toxic medicine Ernest was feeding her. The evidence was there, but it was purely circumstantial. They desperately needed a real confession. They needed someone on the inside to finally break. And Tom White knew exactly who the weakest link in the chain was. He didn't look at the hardened killers. He looked directly at the terrified man sweating profusely at his dying wife's bedside. He looked at Ernest Burkhart. Getting Ernest to talk would require a psychological teardown unlike anything the Bureau had ever attempted. It wouldn't be about physical torture. It would be about extreme mental isolation. It would be about systematically showing Ernest that the powerful uncle he blindly worshipped, the exact man he had sold his immortal soul for, viewed him as absolutely nothing more than collateral damage. Tom White understood that you absolutely don't break a man like Ernest Burkhart with your fists. You break him with the cold, hard truth. White sat directly across from Ernest in a suffocating, windowless interrogation room. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his heavy hands on the oak table. He just slowly, methodically laid out the undeniable paper trail. He showed Ernest the bank transfers. He showed him the sworn signed statements from the hired outlaws who had pulled the triggers. And then White played his absolute devastating masterstroke. He looked Ernest dead in the eye and calmly explained that William Hale was already building a legal wall around himself. He told Ernest that his beloved uncle, the king, was actively setting him up to take the entire catastrophic fall. You could almost hear the glass shattering inside Ernest's mind. The grand illusion of family loyalty, the comforting lie he had told himself every single time he handed his ailing wife a poisoned glass of water, it all evaporated in a single instant. He wasn't a respected partner in a criminal empire. He was just a disposable, convenient scapegoat. And so, the heavy dam finally broke. The brutal confession poured out of Ernest like black oil erupting from a struck well. He named the cold-blooded shooters. He named the quiet, middle-class middlemen who arranged the bloody payments. And most importantly, he pointed his shaking finger directly at his uncle. But getting a messy confession in a sweaty room was just the very first skirmish. Winning the actual drawn-out war in an Oklahoma courtroom was something entirely different. You really have to understand the deeply prejudiced judicial and social climate of the 1920s. A white man had never, in the entire documented history of the state, been convicted of murdering an Osage person. It simply did not ever happen. When the trial finally began, it was a grotesque circus. Hale walked into the courtroom wearing perfectly tailored suits, smiling broadly at the jury, shaking hands with the armed guards. He looked exactly like a popular politician arriving at a parade, not a mass murderer on trial for his life. He truly believed the system would protect him, because he literally was the local system. His hired thugs blatantly intimidated key witnesses right in the crowded, smoky hallways. He blatantly bribed the selected jurors. In fact, the very first trial predictably ended in a hung jury. The institutional rot was truly that incredibly deep. But Tom White and the stubborn federal prosecutors flatly refused to back down. They relentlessly brought Hale back to face trial again. They aggressively forced the jury to look past the bow tie and look at the brutal, undeniable reality of the fresh blood soaking the prairie dirt. When the guilty verdict finally came down, it sent a massive shockwave across the entire country. William Hale, the once untouchable, smiling king, was permanently sentenced to life in Leavenworth Federal Prison. Ernest Burkhart, the weak, loyal nephew, was securely sent away too. The reign of terror, according to the official, triumphant government press release, was officially over. But what about the brave Molly? She barely survived. Once Ernest was dragged away in heavy handcuffs, the daily diabetes treatments immediately stopped. The deadly poison slowly left her frail system. Her physical body recovered, but her soul bore horrific scars that no doctor on earth could ever heal. Think carefully about the sheer psychological weight of that survival. Imagine sitting in a quiet courtroom and finally realizing that the man who slept next to you every night, the father of your children, had actively, deliberately plotted the systematic extermination of your entire bloodline. She bravely divorced Ernest immediately. She took her surviving children and walked away from the ashes of her family. She lived out the rest of her days quietly, passing away in 1937. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover eagerly took Tom White's hard-won, bloody victory and cynically turned it into a massive public relations campaign. He used the horrific Osage murders to aggressively brand his newly formed FBI as the ultimate scientific crime-fighting machine. He loudly pushed for radio shows about it. He heavily encouraged articles. He made absolutely sure every American citizen knew the federal government had swooped in and saved the day. But here is the truly devastating, heartbreaking twist. The incredibly dark, buried secret that David Grann uncovered when he went back to Oklahoma almost a full century later. The FBI's neat, tidy, comforting Hollywood ending was a complete, fabricated lie. Hoover's carefully crafted narrative loudly claimed that William Hale was the lone mastermind, and once the snake's head was chopped off, the innocent town was entirely safe. That simply wasn't true at all. When Grann spent months Digging through the dusty, forgotten archives, he looked closely at the actual documented mortality rates of the Osage during that specific era. He found chilling records of dozens, perhaps hundreds of Osage people who died under highly mysterious, uninvestigated circumstances. People who were suddenly poisoned, thrown downstairs, or casually found shot. People who had absolutely zero connection to William Hale. Hale wasn't a lone, rare genius of evil. He was simply the loudest, most ruthlessly organized symptom of a deeply sick, corrupted society. There were countless other guardians out there doing the exact same murderous thing. Highly respected bankers, quiet local merchants, smiling town lawyers, ordinary next-door neighbors. They were all quietly, systematically poisoning, starving, or shooting the specific Osage people legally assigned to their care. It wasn't just a single, isolated criminal conspiracy. It was a sweeping culture of complicity. A dark culture that silently, collectively agreed that Native American lives were inherently worth far less than the crude oil buried deep beneath their feet. The Bureau caught one particularly bad apple and proudly, intentionally ignored the entirely rotten orchard. This is the incredibly ugly psychological truth we desperately try to avoid confronting. It is very easy to point at a theatrical, arrogant villain like William Hale and loudly declare that he is the absolute monster, he is the strange anomaly. It is much, much harder to look at an entire functioning community of ordinary, church-going citizens and admit the terrifying underlying truth. Under the right conditions, with enough unregulated, massive money on the line, almost anyone can seamlessly become a ruthless predator. The sudden Osage wealth brought out the absolute worst in the human spirit. It clearly, painfully showed us that institutional systems designed to protect the vulnerable are very often just sophisticated legal cages secretly built by thieves. And the terrifying, lingering question Robert McKee would ask us to sit with tonight is exactly this. If the social rules were temporarily suspended tomorrow and a massive unearned river of wealth suddenly flowed through your own quiet town, how many of your friendly, smiling neighbors would simply look the other way while you disappeared? We deeply, desperately want to believe the dark, violent days of the flower moon are safely, permanently behind us. But fundamental human nature simply doesn't evolve that quickly. The deep-seated greed just cleverly changes its clothes. The modern predators don't use crude poison and heavy revolvers anymore. They use predatory banking loans, complex digital algorithms, and bulletproof legal contracts. If you want to keep exploring the dark machinery of history and human psychology with me, just hit the subscribe button and let's keep uncovering the truth together.